Hello everybody, this will be the second video to my master course on Python. A little bit more of an introduction here, a little bit more of code along that I'll be having everyone do. And we won't just be going over the terminal and the print statement. So on today's agenda, I have using comments and a bit of an overview on Python, just in case if it's been a while since the previous video. I'll be going over variables, which are very essential when programming in Python. I will show you the three basic data types that we use in Python that are very essential when programming, and we'll be writing with Python. And here I just want to give out a special thanks to my friends Alan and Yuva for creating the curriculum that I'll be using in this video and several other videos. And if you will, please subscribe and like this video. I really want the channel to grow, and I really want several people who don't know much about programming and Python and several other computer science courses that I'll be making in the future to hear about me. So that will really help, and if you're not going to do that, please at least subscribe so I can show some more pictures of this guy right here. So we'll jump right in. So in my curriculum, I will start by going over the print statement. So the print statement is kind of what I was mentioning before. You input words into the parentheses right here and you get an output. So for example right here, I get, if it'll load, I should get hello world because that's what I'm passing in right here. Now, I can show you how to write that from the ground up in this code editor that I have right here called REPL. And REPL, you just on the internet search up REPL and it should pull up and sign in. I won't go over that right now, but if you need any help on that, I can make a separate video if you leave some comments below. So in REPL, if I just go print exactly how I had it before, hello world, and I run this, I should get hello world. And without this, what we're passing inside, without it, it should look simply like this. And of course there's quotes in the middle of the parentheses, which is very important. And here you can input anything. In the previous video I input pizza, and in return I get both hello world and pizza. So those are very essential when programming in Python. And the first thing that I will show you besides the print statement is comments. Now comments are not what, you don't get an output with comments. They're more of helping other programmers that you're programming with understand what you have. So under my script here, if I were to say a comment, which is a hashtag, which is if you were to press shift 3, you get the hashtag. And here I can write, this is a print function. When I run this, I get the same thing, because this is commented out. This the computer does not read. What's interesting though is if I go here with a line that the computer is reading and I add a comment next to it, that's commented out. If I run this again, it's gone. So the computer is not reading this. But essentially comments are really useful when you have long lists of code and you want to show what this code does without having other programmers read it and try to comprehend what it is. And back in the curriculum, I have this example here with double quotes. And essentially, that's another way of writing comments, but several lines of comments. So you can see here, this took probably 5 lines. And the comments are, saying unimportant things, but at least you can see here that that's what the double quotes do. And another trick here, this is what I use all the time, is if you press Control Dash, I don't know if it's different on other keyboards. I'm pretty sure on my Mac that I'm using right now, if you press Command Slash, then it'll get the same thing. You can comment everything out. So I'll show you right here. If I do Command Slash, Control Slash, everything is commented out. I don't want that anymore. Just do it again. So that's very helpful, and commenting code out is also helpful if you just don't want the code to be read by the computer for a certain period of time. You can definitely do that. So I will skip this because that's what I went over. Here we have variables. And variables are very essential when programming Python because essentially we're passing in pieces of data and variables allow us to give a name to it. We're branding the data. So if I were to go here, just delete all this, I'm feeling kind of hungry right now. Let me make a food variable. Just call it food. And I'll set that to, my favorite food is Spanish rice. That's a secret that you won't tell anybody, please. So if I go Spanish rice, that's my variable. The variable is food, and it's being set to Spanish rice. If I go down here and I go print food, the computer will read it as Spanish rice because I'm passing in my variable and it's printing whatever that variable is set to. Now, a common misconception is if you pass in food and you print food, then you'll get food, but that's only possible if we put quotes around it. And in turn, we will get food. So that's just different. So that's not confusing. And variables are very, very helpful, as I mentioned before. So for example, and I'll go over the data types a little later, but if I had first num for number, and I set that equal to 2, I can go here, and I can go, actually I'll go down here, print first num, and in return, I should get 2, because I'm setting this variable to 2. Back in the curriculum, I have here the 3 data types as I mentioned before. Now these are very important both when you're programming in Python and you're speaking to other developers in Python jargon. And you'll hear a lot, string, float, boolean. You'll hear all of these words that you might not know currently, but as you continue programming, then you'll get more used to them. So a string, X right here is set to a string, which essentially means it is a quote, it's quotes. Something is inside the quotes. Kind of like back here I had Spanish rice, that was quotes. That right there is a string. We have an integer, which that's pretty self-explanatory. If any of you have taken a math class, you've heard the word integer, and that's essentially a whole number. So right here, first num2, that's an integer, and I can make first float, and that is a decimal. So, I don't know, 2.0. That's practically the same thing, but the computer will read it as a float because there's that decimal in it. So if I were to print first float, in turn, I shall get 2.0. So here we have, and I can show you how we use comments too. Here we have printing string right here. Below that we have printing float, printing int. And below that we have printing float, if I can spell printing right. So here you can see how the 3 of them are different, and I won't go more into that because it's pretty self-explanatory at this point. Another function that we can use in Python is this type function. It's weird. When I first learned about type, I thought it was extremely weird and I was uncomfortable with the concept, but then I started to realize that this is very helpful when we have pieces of data in our coding and we want to know what it is instead of having to go all the way up and look at, I don't know, a variable that's set to 2.0 versus 2. We want to just see, okay, what is x equal to? Well, x right here is a string. So when we call that, it's going to tell us that, oh, that is, it's frustrating. I'll just do it up here. So we can do print type, and we want to know what food is. So food should be, and just so there's no confusion, I'll comment all of this out. So we know that food is a string, as I mentioned previously. What if we want to know what first num is? Well, we'll see that that's an int. So once you start to understand this whole type function, you start to go, oh, okay, I realize the concept a little bit more, and it's not as tricky. The trickiest part at this point is understanding when you'll use them, and we'll get more into that later. So here we have rules for when you're naming variables. So it's exciting when you learn about variables and you can set that to anything. We want to call them, I don't know, our favorite superheroes, whatever we want to set these variables to. But there's a sort of responsibility as a programmer where the more you're programming, the more you have to realize the variables you set, the names of your variables have to coincide with what they're doing. So here we have several examples of variables that can be anything, and I won't read any of this out loud because I'm sure you guys can read it. But the responsibility comes in when we do this sort of thing. And as you can see, somebody already hit play here, so it says. So the reason why we get that is because, for example, here, if you set an integer to my variable, then excuse me, let me rephrase that. If you put an integer in front of my variable, the computer's not gonna be happy with that. If you get a dash in between the my variable and you call it John, like that dash right there shouldn't be. Neither should this space. So you can start to understand these three things are not okay when you're naming variables. And typically most programmers won't make that mistake because they'll see something like this and they'll go, okay, this is how I'm comfortable with writing my variables. I haven't seen a lot of people write them this way, but if you have a tendency to do so, please don't. And here is just the specific jargon to naming certain variables. Here we have camel case, which is an lowercase word, uppercase, and these are all going to spit out the same thing. I can show you right here. Actually, I'd have to print them all. So if I were to print my variable name, it's gonna give me John. So that works. But here you can see on this comment that that's camel case. Versus here, that's Pascal case because there's an uppercase, and then snake case, which I've seen the most often, which I use personally, is my underscore variable name, variable underscore name. And all of these work perfectly, and all of these look professional, and it's just great to use. Here I'll go right here, and this is probably the most essential part of all I'll show you today in this video. So this is a function, and that's a terrible way of describing it, but essentially a function, how I like to teach this is, it's a box where you can put things in, and then you can go back later and look inside the box and it'll give you something in return. And the analogy isn't 100%, but if you start to look at functions as their own little boxes that you create, then you'll start to realize that each function that you program has its own thing. Now here, this function, myfunc, has x, which is considered a local variable since this variable is inside the function. And we're printing Python is, and we're concatenating this, which is another way of saying we're including this variable to our string. And in return, we get Python is fantastic. Versus here, this is outside of the function. I'll comment this out so there's no confusion. This right here is considered a global variable because it's outside of a function. It's at the very top of the script. And you can do the same thing down here. Print Python is X, and you get awesome. So the difference between local and global variables is local variables are inside of a function versus global variables are outside of a function, and functions do their own things. So this here is the print statement, this here is a variable. Together they print Python is awesome, versus this whole function right here, well, it has a variable and you can print Python is fantastic. Here is global keywords that I won't really get into, but you can read some of the information here on what essentially this is all about. And I will move to the bottom. Here we have another print type statement, so we find whatever x can be a variable to. And here we have numeric types in Python. So I just went over this a moment ago, but here string isn't a numeric value because that's more of a word name, something that we set to, versus here we have a complex value, and I don't see these a lot, I'm currently learning intermediate advanced Python, and I don't see complex values like this quite too often, even in difficult code. But they're out there. You see, even right here, don't bother understanding this. Just know that they're out there, and you'll have some scripts that might use them. So if we go down here, we have our 3 data types, float, int, and a complex number. And if we were to press play right here, then we get the types of what each of these are and what essentially they are. So I will end the video right here because that was a lot to go over. But to recap, we have variables, which are things we can set other things to. So for example, I had food and I set that to Spanish rice. First num, set that to 2. We have functions, which are, and I'll show you how to write this really quickly. You write the def keyword, define, and we can do my func. So let's do like this one, might be better. And then you put this colon right here to know that you're indenting the line, and you can do, I'm gonna steal this variable right here to spare me from typing. We have our variable name right here, and then we can do print I love, and we're concatenating this with food. And this is my function, because I have my variable here and I'm telling it what to do. Oh, excuse me. I have to call the function. That's the last thing that you have to do. Down here at the bottom, you call the function by listing what you name it and putting parentheses. And you can relate this to a print statement, kind of like how you have a variable and then you want to print that variable, but you have to do it at the bottom. Here, you want to call that function by calling its name with the parentheses. And here I have I love Spanish rice. So that's a function. And we went over the 3 data types, float, string, and an integer. We went over integers, floats, and complex numbers, which complex numbers I didn't go over too much because we don't see that quite often. And the type function, which will essentially, as what's seen right here, will show you what kind of type a variable is. So for example, our first num, that was a float, and it will, excuse me, where am I? First num is an integer, sorry, and it'll tell us that that's an integer. And that is the basics of Python. In the next video that I'll be releasing, I will go over modules and more in depth on what you can use with functions, and stay tuned to get that. I will see you all later, and I hope this video helped.